In this video, we're going to talk about mood disorders, specifically major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, as well as a few subtypes that I'll get into in a little bit. But before I do, let's talk generally for a moment about mood disorders. This is a category of psychological disorders that's characterized by severe disturbances in mood and emotions, most often depression, but also mania and elation, and I'll define all of that in just a moment. But I want to start with a disclaimer. As we discussed in regards to anxiety disorders, our moods naturally fluctuate, and it's perfectly normal to feel happy sometimes and sad other times. People with mood disorders, in contrast, have extreme fluctuations in their moods that impair their ability to function, and that's a theme you're going to see come up again and again in this video. Mood disorders, this is an umbrella term. Within mood disorders, we have depressive disorders, where the defining feature is depression, extremely negative mood, hopelessness, that can be so severe, these moods can be so severe that regular drives such as hunger and even sex drives are reduced or eliminated altogether. Now, in contrast to the depressive disorders, where depression is the main feature, we also have bipolar and related disorders, where mania is the defining feature, and this is the exact opposite of depression. If depression is extremely negative mood, mania can be thought of very broadly as extremely positive mood, in which a person is really talkative, has grandiose ideas, thinks they can do anything, has so much energy, and may behave recklessly at the same time. But before we talk more about mania, let's talk about major depressive disorder, which is a mood disorder characterized by depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, and anhedonia. This is a term meaning an inability to experience pleasure, a decreased motivation to engage in activities that you used to find enjoyable. And doing those activities, if you can force yourself to do them, isn't really enjoyable either. Take, for example, a person who really enjoys running or exercising, but now they have major depressive disorder, they have no motivation to run or exercise, and again, if they can bring themselves to even do it, it's not really very enjoyable for them. That's anhedonia. Now, in order to be diagnosed with MDD, a person needs to experience a total of 5 related symptoms for at least 2 weeks. For example, weight and or appetite disturbances. And from a lot of these, you're going to see they can go in either direction. So this can be extreme weight loss, even when they're not on a diet, or this could be overeating. Similarly, sleep disturbances. Maybe they're sleeping all the time. They can't even bring themselves to get out of bed. Or maybe they have insomnia and they can't sleep at all. These are both characteristic of major depressive disorder depending on the person. We also have psychomotor agitation and psychomotor retardation. Again, sort of either direction. Psychomotor agitation is where a person is noticeably fidgety and jittery, and maybe they're pacing, they can't sit still, things like that. Psychomotor retardation is the opposite, where maybe the person talks really slowly, talks very softly, maybe talks in monotone, whereas normally they would be pretty animated. Or maybe they move slowly, right? This is psychomotor retardation. Fatigue or loss of energy, we commonly see this in MDD, major depressive disorder. Feelings of worthlessness or guilt and difficulty concentrating, maybe indecisiveness, whereas previously they were pretty decisive. And finally, suicidal ideation, which is perhaps the most dangerous of all of these symptoms. These are thoughts of death, not just a fear of dying, but really thinking about or planning suicide, and even making an actual suicide attempt. All of this is part of suicidal ideation. Now, I want to pause for a moment to highlight something about this slide, in particular, the duration. As we've seen with other psychological disorders, there's a duration requirement for diagnosis. This time, however, that period is much shorter. Instead of 6 months for generalized anxiety disorder, for example, these symptoms only need to last for 2 weeks to be considered for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Now, why might this be the case? A large part of the answer lies in the severity of symptoms. Whereas someone with generalized anxiety disorder might be worrying excessively and perhaps having trouble sleeping, someone with major depressive disorder might be contemplating suicide. To allow those sorts of symptoms to last for 6 months would be obviously problematic, so the duration requirements are reduced. As I mentioned before, there are some subtypes of depression. I'll tell you about them now. We have seasonal pattern depression. This is where a person experiences the symptoms of MDD, but only at particular times of the year. For example, in the colder months, maybe fall and winter. We also have peripartum onset depression, where a person, a woman, experiences the symptoms of MDD during pregnancy or in the 4 weeks following the birth of their child. You may have heard this called postpartum depression, really referring to the same thing here. This form of depression is often accompanied by panic attacks as well as feelings of guilt and agitation, and it's really common. There are recent estimates suggesting that the disorder affects as many as 14% of women who give birth. And finally, we have persistent depressive disorder. This is consistent depression lasting at least 2 years and accompanied by at least 2 symptoms of major depressive disorder. This was previously called dysthymia, if you've heard of that term before. Importantly, people with persistent depressive disorder don't meet the criteria for major depressive disorder. These are separate diagnoses. Now, they may be consistently sad and melancholy for a long period of time. They may share the symptoms of MDD. That's a requirement, but it's different. It's a different disorder. The intensity is different. The number of symptoms is different as well. Now let's talk about bipolar disorder, a disorder characterized by extreme shifts in mood from one polar opposite to the other. Bipolar, 2 poles, right? Commonly from mania to depression and back, although it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, a diagnosis requires manic episodes, but it doesn't actually require depressive episodes. So previously this was known as manic depression, and it's still commonly called manic depression, but that doesn't really capture the full range of presentations you might see of the disorder. Now, we've defined mania, but I haven't really said anything about a manic episode, which is obviously related, but I want to define that real particularly right now. A manic episode is a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased activity or energy lasting at least 1 week. Now, a person in a manic episode might be extremely talkative, as I hinted at before, even with strangers, people they don't know, or extremely irritable or even hostile. The person may also exhibit what we refer to as a flight of ideas, frequently shifting from talking about one topic to talking about a different, completely unrelated topic. And manic episodes are often accompanied with reckless and even dangerous behaviors, like not sleeping for days on end because you feel like you have so much energy and you don't need it, or even quitting jobs, right? So serious consequences. There's also a rapid cycling subtype of bipolar disorder that I'd like to mention at least quickly, in which people experience at least 4 manic episodes or a combination of 4 manic and depressive episodes within a single year. So it has to be pretty common, a rapid cycle from one to the other. Now let's talk about the etiology or causes of mood disorders, starting with biological factors. So we know that mood disorders have strong genetic and biological components. For example, the twin concordance rate, that is the percentage of twins who share major depressive disorder, is 50% for identical twins and only 38% for fraternal twins. For bipolar disorder, that difference is even larger, 67% versus 16% respectively. So the fact that twins who share more genetic information also have higher concordance rates, more likely to share the disorder, right? This suggests that there's a strong genetic component to these disorders. We also find that people with mood disorders tend to have an imbalance of neurotransmitters such as serotonin and norepinephrine, which are both important for mood and various other bodily functions like hunger, sleep, and sex drives, all of which are symptoms of mood disorders, as we've discussed already. And as we've talked about in previous videos, the diathesis stress model of psychological disorders suggests that these sorts of biological factors, the diathesis, are typically accompanied by psychological or environmental factors, the stress. There are, for example, several cognitive factors that influence the development and perpetuation of mood disorders. For example, a person with a mood disorder may experience cognitive distortions in which they view problems as much bigger than they really are. This is called catastrophizing, which we have learned about before. And they may ruminate about those problems. They think about it over and over and over again. We also have learned hopelessness, which is a cognitive theory of depression proposing that negative emotions are accompanied by these negative expectations about what's going to happen. And that combination, these negative expectations, these negative thoughts about what's going to happen, lead to depression. Now, these expectations tend to be stable. It's always going to be this way, right? And global. This is going to affect everything. Again, part of the catastrophizing. As a final note, the cognitive distortions that I just mentioned a moment ago tend to cluster around thoughts of the self, the world, and the future. And we refer to this as the cognitive triad, which, as you'll see, connects to hopelessness theory. So the cognitive triad is the idea that people have negative thoughts about three different areas. Triad, right? Three. First of all, the self. I'm ugly, I'm worthless, I'm a failure. The world. No one loves me. And the future. I feel hopeless, right? Hopelessness theory, because it's always going to be this way. This is never going to change. This is the cognitive triad, which is also a cognitive factor important to the development and perpetuation of mood disorders.